This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Having a better sense of who we tried to be and who we shaped ourselves to be can help us in our parenting, because it gives us a better sense of who we are and what makes us happy and what we wanted from life. And I think that that's just a good thing, no matter how old you are.
Welcome to the Parent Footprint Podcast with Dr. Dan. I am Dr. Dan, your host. And let me tell you about our mission at Parent Footprint. That mission is to make the world a more loving and compassionate place, one parent and one child at a time. At Parent Footprint, we believe the key to raising happy, healthy, and engaged kids is for us parents to seek the same in our own lives: happiness, health, and engagement. We believe that awareness is the foundation of your vision of successful parenting, and with increased awareness and intention, we can be purposeful about leaving a healthy footprint on our children. Today's show is called The Rocket Years: How Your 20s Launch the Rest of Your Life, with our esteemed guest, Elizabeth Segran.
Hi.
Hi, Elizabeth. Nice to meet you. I'm going to say some nice things about you because people need to know what you're all about. And this is very interesting. So Elizabeth has spent her childhood in Brussels, Paris, Singapore, and Jakarta, thanks to her father's job in the airline industry. Then she moved to New York to attend Columbia University and went on to get her PhD at UC Berkeley, not far from here, in classical Indian poetry, with an emphasis on women, gender, and sexuality. She's a senior staff writer at the business magazine Fast Company, where she writes about fashion. Her work has been published in a wide range of publications, including The Atlantic, The Nation, Foreign Policy, Salon, and The New Republic. And most importantly, she lives in Boston with her husband, daughter, and her books. And we are talking today about her new book, which is the title of the show, The Rocket Years. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, okay, as we were talking right before the show start, what I was excited about this conversation is this is a specific decade of life that we're focusing on today, and that your book focuses on with awesome research and data we're going to discuss. And this is like what made you or propels you to focus on this generation?
Well, it was actually a very specific moment that led to the genesis of this book. I had entered my early 30s, and I had a new baby. I'd recently gotten married, and it was 8:00 on a Wednesday night. And I had spent 2 hours getting my daughter to go to sleep. And I collapsed on the couch, exhausted, with my husband. And we surveyed our living room, which was sort of taken over by this small child, with the crumbled crackers on the floor and toys everywhere. And we looked at each other and we said, how did we get here? We love the life that we have. But it was really interesting how in our 20s, life had felt so fluid and full of possibilities. And then suddenly, in a few short years, it seemed like we had made all of these decisions that had created the life that we now have. And I suddenly became very curious about those big decisions that we made that we didn't even really know we were making at the time. And my husband's actually a political scientist, and he spends his days, thinking through social science data. And he said to me, you know what, Liz, we can actually answer some of these questions. So I spent 2 years digging through a lot of social science data about a lot of the big decisions we make, including the ones that many of us are already thinking about, things like our career, our love lives, thinking about potentially having children someday, to things that we don't really think that much about, like, our friendships, our passion projects, our faith, things that sort of are part of the background in our 20s. And I look at what the data says about the decisions we make and where they lead us. And I couple this with my own, experiences in my 20s. And that has led to this book, which I hope is a guidebook to others who are going through that journey.
Yes, it's the launching, right? The rocket. It's this launch point. And as you're talking, I was thinking about, my wife and I had very similar moments where we're like, how did all of this happen? And yes, isn't this what we wanted? And how did we get here? So totally relate to that. And it just seems that so many of these milestones are, would you say, like subconsciously transmitted to us? I mean, is it sociology? Is it psychology? Is it family? Like, how do you come to conceptualize all of these steps of adulthood that we are supposed to take, so to speak?
I think it's a lot of those different things together. I think that there are some things that are just part of life for any generation. A lot of us, no matter what generation we're in, and no matter what point in history, go through this point where we separate from our families, and we have this opportunity to think about what we want to bring with us from our childhood into the rest of our life, and what we want to let go of. And I think that is something that every person, no matter what point in history, has to deal with. But then there are very specific things that occur because of the particular zeitgeist that we're in. And, as somebody who's the, part of the oldest generation of millennials, there were very specific things that I experienced that my parents didn't experience. And so, for instance, in my life, my parents were very much encouraging me to pursue my dream job, not really to think about money necessarily when I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my future. They really told me to go out and create a life that I would be happy with. Happiness was the big thing that they were trying to give me, the freedom to be happy, which was very different from what their parents had told them. Their parents were much more interested in ensuring that they were stable, which was, I guess, in their time, their idea of the best thing that they could give their child, right? Happiness was stability.
Right.
And so that was very different for me. And I think that, for each generation, we have a different sort of set of values that we're given, but they all come with challenges. Being told that you can go out and do whatever you want and try and achieve some sort of deep personal happiness. That's actually quite a lot of pressure to give to a 20-something, to try and figure out what happiness looks like. And so it's all of those things combined. And so in my book, I think that the real point of my book is that there are a lot of competing anxieties and thoughts that 20-somethings have to deal with. And I think the most important thing that we can give 20-somethings is the opportunity to step back and think a little bit about what really matters to them and what they really value. Because I think that coming back to that is the thing that will help them, create their own itinerary in the years to come. But we really need to give them this opportunity to stop in the midst of all of that decision making and all of those anxieties to sort of think about those things.
So would you say that, stepping back and thinking about what matters, what's meaningful and what matters, how then is that different, or would you say it's different than the prior message you referred to of follow your passion, follow your dream?
Well, here's the thing. I think that I experienced this myself. And the thing is that you're given this idea that, you need to go out there and find whatever makes you happy. And the problem is that when you start life, when you're in your 20s, you don't know what that is. And it actually takes having experiences in the real world to try and figure out who you are and what the world is actually like. And so I think that the real tension in your 20s is really this, on the one hand, this desire to go out and make really good decisions. And on the other hand, this desire to kind of make mistakes and go out there and have experiences that are sort of off the grid, right? That are not part of the plan. I think that every 20-something deals with these two competing forces. On the one hand, they want to, they want to try and like create the right path into their future. And on the other hand, they don't want to do that at all. They want to go out and, date all the wrong people and quit jobs and do all of that stuff. And actually, I think that the point is that, and in my book, I explain this, that those two competing forces are actually not competing at all. They're mutually related and they're complementary, because it is in going out there and seeing the world and having all of these experiences that you sort of get a better sense of what will make you happy. And it's in the balance of these two things that you can sort of find your way to this ideal of creating, a happy life and finding a career that really is satisfying. And so that's really what I mean by giving young people the opportunity to dwell on those things. It's giving them kind of that freedom to have both of those things together, right? The desire to make good decisions and the desire to go off the grid.
And I like that, because I mean, it's so important thinking of our parenting influence and persuasion at times is, there's been this push for, I think, I don't know, too long, this over focus on success. So it's like passion, find your passion and be successful. And what you've just added to the conversation is try new things, see what's out there. And I'm going to like permission to fail.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and I think that what's interesting is that I think most of us have that impulse already, right? We have that there are all these moments in your 20s, and I'm sure, if you think back to your 20s, you had this as well, where, you feel like you're supposed to be doing A, right? You're supposed to be working your way towards this career or, being in this stable relationship. And you suddenly feel this desire to escape that and to do something totally different. And I think that creates a lot of anxiety and stress for people in their 20s. I certainly felt that a lot. On the one hand, I wanted to be trying to find the career that I was going to be in the long haul and work my way up through the ranks. And I also felt this powerful desire to just quit everything and move to India for the summer or backpack through Indonesia. And I did that. And I just remember always feeling like I wasn't doing the right thing, because when I was at the job, putting in my hours and doing the grunt work, I felt like I was missing out on this experience of traveling the world. And when I was traveling the world, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm really missing out on this opportunity to work my way up through a particular career track. And ultimately, what I want to, give 20-somethings, and what I think that parents should really help their 20-somethings deal with is to tell them that actually both of those things are important, because you learn so much about yourself and what you want and what you don't want through those experiences that don't seem like they're helping you follow a linear path. But the key though is not to just kind of go off and do those things unthinkingly. It's to be purposeful as you're kind of experiencing that chaos, right? And stopping to think for a second, what is it about my desk job that I didn't like, that forced me on this, on this other path, or pushed me into this other direction? What is it about this seemingly stable relationship that was making me feel constrained? Why did I decide that I want to get out of that? It's about sort of thinking and being thoughtful through that whole experience that I think will give you the knowledge you need to make those good decisions when they are confronting you.
And do you, the word is that the newer generations seem to be more introspective and more, I don't know if introspective is the word, but definitely go more with what they feel is right in their life. Like more like they don't want as much, I know I'm generalizing here. They don't want as much stuff. They want to have a lot of flexibility. They care about others in the environment. Like, do you find that I don't know, stereotype holds for this generation?
Yeah, and I actually think that there's a lot of research that absolutely supports that. I think that there's a lot of research about how young people are thinking about careers that supports that. So young people, people in their 20s and early 30s, are not interested in salary as a top reason when they're picking a job, right? As a top motivation for taking a job. They're much more interested in finding work that aligns with their values and their passions, and finding a community that they will enjoy working with. When it comes to things like institutions, like religion, for instance, young people are a lot less concerned about following some sort of externally prescribed path, right, from like an organized religion. But they're also deeply spiritual, and so they're basically interested in sort of creating their own path through spirituality. So we're seeing that this is a generation that is very thoughtful, and that is very introspective, to use a word that you just used. And I think that it makes a lot of sense, actually, because this is the generation that is a product of the generation that came before. And I think that our parents, people in their 50s, 60s today, felt very constrained by their own childhoods and what they were given. And their response was to kind of give their children a lot of freedom to go out and do whatever they thought was best. But I think that the caveat here is that it's hard. It's hard to figure out what you value, and it's hard to figure out who you are when you're so new in the world. You haven't had that many experiences, and so there's a lot of pressure that goes along with their approach as well.
Mm-hmm. And one of those big decisions is choosing who one is going to partner with, seemingly for lifetime, but we know it doesn't always work out. And the research that you quote about divorce and age is so interesting. So tell everyone about what you found.
It's so fascinating. I mean, in general, marriage trends have shifted a lot over the last couple of decades, and particularly the last decade. And it seems like actually marriage and long-term stable marriages are having a resurgence. And so that's kind of the optimistic take on it. So it turns out that, young people today, they're being a lot more deliberate about who they partner with. They're getting married a little bit later than previous generations. Usually by their early 30s, so that they're sort of timing it for when they want to start their families. And relationships today marriages today are lasting longer. They're more enduring. The divorce rate is going down. But here's the thing about that, though. What sociologists are finding is that people tend to be pairing up largely based on socioeconomic backgrounds. So people tend to be pairing up based on, whether they have college degrees or grad degrees and how much money they make. So people are pairing up entirely based on socioeconomics, it sounds like. When you look at the data. And
is there any love in there, or just socioeconomic?
It's interesting. There's a ton, I think there is a lot of love. But I think what people are finding is that people tend to love and have more enduring relationships with people who are like them. And I think a lot of the the psychological data actually supports that people who are similar to one another, both in terms of socioeconomics and in terms of personalities, tend to get along better and have more stable relationships. And so I think young people are finding that to be true. But the problem here, though, is that it's actually much easier for people with education and money to have those kind of stable relationships. And what we're finding is that people who don't have the privilege of education and wealth are having a much harder time marrying and having stable relationships. So people are having multiple relationships and lots of children out of wedlock, and that inherently is not necessarily a bad thing, but what we're seeing is that it's actually exacerbating the divide, the economic divide in this country. So basically, people with privilege and education and wealth are creating families that are wealthier, and people who don't have those privileges are not. And so it's actually exacerbating what we're already seeing as a growing inequality in this country.
with ramifications. And like you said, this isn't a judgment about what's right, wrong, good, or bad, but it does have consequences for economic status, education, and child's experiences.
Absolutely. And and I think, as I was working through the book, it's so interesting because it seems like people who have, the privilege of education and a good job, they're actually being very strategic about their family planning. They're waiting till they're financially stable, and then they're having children. Very strategically thinking about how their career is going to play into this, how the husband and wife's job are going to fit into this whole dynamic. It's a very thoughtful and drawn out process. And on the flip side of things, people from poorer backgrounds are just having a much harder time building the kinds of families that they want. And so it's just kind of creating generational problems here.
And you also wrote about age for those that do get married, right? So we're now from this data, we're talking about not people who don't get married, but people who do get married. You found that there's definitely an age window of about 4 years that people are less likely to get divorced if married at that age. I'm setting you up here.
I know, yes, and I think that this is going to create a lot of anxiety in a lot of people. So let me give a lot of context for this. But yes. There's actually this kind of fascinating research that has shown that actually, people who get married between the ages of 28 and 32 tend to have the longer lasting marriages and more stable marriages. And this is actually really interesting insight because until recently, people thought that basically the older you got married, the better, right? Because the more mature you would be, the more financial stability you had. And so really, people should be very deliberate and kind of wait until they're ready to get married. And this research actually threw a wrench in that because it said that basically past a certain point, people's marriages actually become a little bit less stable. And there's a lot of economics data about this. So they've looked at census data about marriage and divorce rates to find this information. But there isn't actually that much sociological and psychological data about why it is that people past the age of 32 begin to see declining rates of or increasing rates of divorce and declining rates of marital happiness. But I think one theory is just that, as you get older, you just kind of become more set in your ways, and it becomes a little bit harder to adapt to sharing a life with another person. And so I think that that's just a really valuable thing to keep in mind. Now, the caveat here is that they were looking at all marriages in the United States when they got this, when they came to the conclusion about the 28 to 32 window. And so there are plenty of people who got married way before 28 and way past 32 that have had very happy and stable marriages. But what I do think that this points to is that, it's actually, quite important for us to be thinking just about what we want our lives to look like, and to sort of have a plan. If marriage is very important to us, and if that's something that we want to create in our own lives, then it might be valuable to sort of think about, trying to forge those relationships in a timely way. And then also, I guess, if you're past that point, if you're in your 30s and you want to get married and you're not married, that there are plenty of people who do that and have very successful marriages. I think the thing to keep in mind there is that it's possible that you may have a slightly harder time, forming that kind of union and that kind of household, because you haven't you've spent a lot of time alone, right? And so that's just something to keep in mind that might help you as you're building, a relationship with another person at that point.
Absolutely. And so, yes, everyone, these are statistics, and statistics are on big numbers, and there are always people who fall outside of the statistics who are happy and have long-term relationships. So don't, as Liz was saying, don't panic. You're good. You're good. But this is really interesting data as we're talking about, like what we're really talking about in your book is giving people in their 20s information to guide them through these years so they have information that can be helpful when they make all of these different types of decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I think it's just really important to start from the outset by saying that there is no one right path. There's only the right path for you. And, and all of this data can sound very anxiety inducing when you first hear it. But the most important thing, I think, is to take a step back and just think a little bit, as I mentioned before, about what you envisage your life looking like. I know that, I have a whole chapter on fertility and on families. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting because, I'm 37 now, and I remember feeling a lot of anxiety about, if I wanted to start a family and when I should do it. And I felt all of this pressure because, I was told that, at the age of 35, my fertility would fall off a cliff. And so I felt this pressure to sort of like find somebody to marry them quickly, start my family, because that's what, I was hearing about what life was supposed to be like. And actually, that wasn't the right way to think about it, because I think that the more fundamental question is, what kind of family do I want? Do I even want children? Right? I didn't even think about that. And as I was writing the book, I spoke to so many different people who created families of all kinds. I spoke to some people who knew that they didn't want to have children. And so the way that they spent their late 20s and early 30s was very different from mine. I spoke to people who wanted to have families, but wanted to have them through adoption or through fostering. And that led to a very different plan for their life. Mm-hmm. And so really the point of that whole example is just that, you shouldn't feel pressure, based on what you're hearing about, the perfect age to get married or the perfect age to start a family. The thing you need to think about is, do you want to get married? Do you want to start a family? What does that look like for you? That's a much better place to be. And then, once you've sort of like, begun to understand, what you want your life to look like, then you can start sort of, forging your own itinerary. But there's no one right path for anybody.
That's key. There is not a right path. And I think that is what's changing when I think about, I'm 49, pushing 50, and I'm just thinking about my growing up and what I was told, which I felt was very supportive about, very supportive about follow what you are into and what you like to do. And of course, there was the, I think, unspoken, you need to get a job with security, right? Just like you need security and you need to be able to provide for yourself and your family. And again, I think I just saw it modeled for me based on my parents' growing up experiences. And I think about parenting our teenagers and young adults is much more of we support you doing what you want to do, and there's lots of options. And I hope that people now know that there are more options than I think in prior generations. I mean, also with just jobs are being created, and there's new names for jobs. Like every year, there's a new type of job. It seems like that's emerging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned at the beginning, I have a PhD in Indian literature, and I spent a lot of time thinking about literature and history when I was working on my PhD. And when I was writing this book, it just occurred to me that we are so privileged. We have so much choice over what our lives look like in every facet of our lives. I think back to people in the ancient world who didn't really even have the option of who they would marry, what they would do with their life. The average woman would just be married off at a young age and have many children, and that was just her life. I think about my grandmother, who just 2 generations ago, who got married at the age of 16, and she didn't get to finish high school. She had 6 children because that was what was expected of her. And I remember her when I was growing up. I remember her being very happy with the life that she had, but her life was scripted for her, right? There was some social script that she had to live out, and that is not my experience. And what's so fascinating is that even now, even generation to generation now, we are giving people more and more control over their life. In my parents' generation, they had a lot less choice over, things like, the kinds of families that they would have. They were operating on a script as well. And with my daughter, when I was pregnant and we were talking about it, my husband and I were very deliberate about saying, we want to be very conscious about what her sexual orientation is going to be. We want to think through, what are signs that, she might be transgender or whatever. We were having these discussions that my parents didn't even think about having.
Sure.
And so the thing, though, is that all of this choice is so empowering, and there are reasons why society has created all of this freedom and choice, and it's because it's wonderful. But I think the thing that we fail to think about is that it's also paralyzing, because when you're going through that and you're given this wealth of choice, you have this kind of anxiety about choosing the wrong path, or picking a less optimal path when you have so many options. And so I think we also need to be really compassionate with our children and with 20-somethings, because they're also dealing with a lot of anxiety about what to choose in this wealth of choice.
Right. There's now so many choices. Right.
Absolutely.
And what we want to help them, as you said, is there's no wrong choice, and there's so many roads, and how to help them embrace those 20s, because you don't get those back, right? you don't. And, when I think back of the 20s and all of the adventure and exploration, and you really don't know what you have until it's gone most of the time. So we don't want to rush. We don't need to. People are taking longer to grow up these days, so to speak. The 18-year-old being an adult, being off on their own, that doesn't happen that much anymore. So another thing is our kids have time, and I think we need to give them that message that
Absolutely.
They have time.
Yeah, and I think that actually helping to figure out some of those decisions, it's really about sometimes not thinking about it so much. And I think that, you're right. We have a long time horizon to get to where we need to be. I think that, most of us, you don't need to start really thinking about things like financial stability and sort of family responsibilities until we enter our 30s. And so we have a decade, which is a long time, especially when you're in your 20s, to get to that point. And so I think a key message that I have is that it takes time to wrestle with these decisions, and a lot of the time that wrestling involves not really consciously thinking about it. So I just basically encourage young people, if you feel like you want to go and experiment with a new job, right? Like you want to just quit this job that seemed like it was right for you to go try this other thing. That might be the right thing to do. If you want to quit your life like I did and spend a summer floating down the Ganges, that might be the right thing to do, because it's in kind of escaping, the everyday life that you have back home, or, the job that you're doing. Sometimes it's in getting a very different, perspective that you figure out what you really care about. And so just kind of, feel free to not think about it all the time, and just go out there and have those experiences that are tugging at you, that you're desiring.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Okay, so you also talk about, in your book, investing in fitness, friends, and hobbies. Tell us about that trifecta.
I actually loved those chapters. I think I actually enjoyed writing them more than some of the other chapters because a lot of this was very new to me. So I think a lot of people are already sort of thinking about their their careers and family planning and things like that. So these are things that I think a lot of us are sort of like have at the back of our minds at least. But there are all these things that we don't even think about in our 20s that will have, in some ways, a much more profound impact on our lifelong happiness. So for instance, something like friendships. There's all of this really fascinating research about how your circle of friends really peaks at the age of 25, which makes a lot of sense because when you're, in your mid 20s, you still have friends from childhood, you have friends from college, and you have some friends from, the workplace. And as time goes on, that circle of friends just keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking.
Yep.
And the amount of time that you spend as well with those friends shrinks as well. So as you get older, you just spend a lot less time with other people. And that doesn't have to be the case. That's just kind of what sociologists have found is the norm. And so most of us, because we're not really thinking that much about our friends, we sort of don't really observe this drop off until it's slightly too late, right? Like, you wake up in your mid 30s one day, like I did with my husband, and you realize that your whole life has been taken over by this 2-year-old, and suddenly you don't have any friends. And what's interesting is that there's all this other data that we're seeing in psychology and medicine that's showing that that community and friendships have an enormous impact on our mental health and our physical health. And so I just think that it's so interesting and it's so important for us to be thinking about our friendships and just basically. I'm not creating, a list of work that 20-somethings necessarily need to do to stay on top of their friendships. But I think it's just worth kind of observing, in your 20s, what's going on with your friends. Who are the people that you like to be around? What does it take to deepen your relationships? Who do you want to be with you in the decades to come? And just kind of spend a little bit of time investing in that. And also the other thing is that making new friends is actually a skill. And most of us, as we get older, kind of get rusty at it. And so if you feel like you're losing a lot of friends and you're not making new ones, there are very specific things you can do to invest in new relationships. And so, I provide some advice about how to do that. But anyway, that's one thing that I didn't really think that much about in my 20s. I just assumed my friends would stick with me, and they didn't. The other chapter that I loved writing about was hobbies and passion projects, because that's another thing that I didn't think about. But basically, there's some data that suggests that, most of us don't pick up new hobbies once we enter our 30s and beyond. And so basically all of the, the hobbies and fun activities that you do when you're at the age of 29 are basically the hobbies that you'll have for your whole life, which is really unfortunate for me because I didn't think at all about the hobbies that I was doing in my 20s. I always assumed I would have more time in my future to trek the Himalayas or, to get really, invested in music, for instance. But, and so I didn't really spend any time thinking about it. And really all the hobbies that I picked up in my 20s were just like very silly ones that I would be dating someone and, he would go to some like experimental art project exhibit. And then I would go and then I would just kind of drop that after a little while. I wasn't thinking about it. But actually, our hobbies are so important because they basically are a way of widening our experience of the world. And they allow us to throw ourselves into something that's not our work and family. And so they have this hugely important place in our life. And so I would just basically urge people in their 20s to not sort of throw aside, the passion projects that they have, but actually invest in them because they're going to be so important throughout your life.
So really what you're espousing, it's sort of like this roadmap. But I don't want to say roadmap because that that means that there are specific paths that they need to take. So I think what you're outlining is all of these different buckets to think about and to know that they're important, but also to know that there's lots of different ways to engage in all of these buckets. It's your job, it's your friendship, it's your hobbies, travel, and there's no right one, but all of these things are really worth thinking about.
I mean, another way of putting it could be that it's kind of like a guidebook. Like if you're visiting
there you go. That's
this country, you just kind of want to know what the big highlights are going to be, and then you can pick the ones that appeal to you. And you can kind of think a little bit about what you want to do in this foreign country, right? How do you want to spend your time while you're on this journey? And then pick the path that best appeals to you.
Yes, a guidebook. That's the word I was searching for. It is a guidebook, and it hits on all of these important elements of life in a very important part of life. And so I love how this is a proactive guide that parents can give their young adults, and also learn from it themselves, I would say early for those of us listening here, which is like, these are all the things to sort of be aware of when we're talking to our kids about their future, or when we're giving them maybe even indirect messages about what we expect for their future.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that, and to the theme of your podcast, I think that the book is actually very valuable to people who are not in their 20s as well. In many ways, I wrote the book for myself because I was really interested in the decisions that I had made in my 20s. And I actually think that our 20s are fascinating because they're really the time in our life when we write our own origin stories. When we kind of, create this narrative about who we are and what we want from life. And I think that even in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, reconnecting with who you were in your 20s allows you to sort of think through, who you decided to be, and what your passions are and what your great ambitions are. Because as anybody who is past their 20s knows, it's so easy to get derailed from, the things that we thought were our great passions and ambitions. And so kind of reconnecting with that can help you sort of inform how you spend your time now, and what you want to focus on now. But I also think that, as parents, kind of having a better sense of, who we tried to be and who we shaped ourselves to be can help us in our parenting, because it gives us a better sense of who we are and what makes us happy and what we wanted from life. And I think that that's just a good thing, no matter how old you are.
Totally agree. And you just, hit the core of the parent footprint notion, right? The more that we are aware of ourselves, we can be purposeful about not only living our own lives, but how we parent our kids. So I wholeheartely agree with you. And you just led us beautifully to the parent footprint moment question.
Yeah.
Here we go. Here it is. The parent footprint moment question is, tell us about a time when you became aware of yourself as a person or as a parent, and that new awareness had a positive impact on your child.
I thought a lot about this, having heard your podcast. And it's interesting because I had a really wonderful childhood, but I had very sort of different parents who had very different approaches. I was very, very close to my father, who was very stable and loving and affectionate and the source of all goodness. And my mother was a little bit more troubled. She herself was adopted and had a difficult childhood. And I think I was very anxious when I was thinking about becoming a parent myself, because, as a woman, I sort of thought that I would, model myself on my mother. I thought that was just kind of how it would go. But when I entered my early 30s, and actually as I was thinking about this book and thinking about myself and who I am, I realized that I'm actually a combination of both of my parents. And I can choose which parts of my parents I want to embody. And when I realized that actually, I mean, maybe this is kind of obvious to your listeners, but it wasn't to me. I decided that, I could actually model myself on my father rather than my mother. And I could sort of imbue myself with the qualities that I loved best about my relationship with him. And now, as a mother of a now 4-year-old, I find that I'm mimicking things that I remember from him. He's passed away now, but I try and model my relationship with my daughter over through my memories of my relationship with him, and I'm so happy. And I think that my relationship with her is a reflection of that beautiful relationship that I have with my dad.
Nice.
And so that was my parent footprint moment.
That's wonderful, because you said you can choose, right? That's what everyone needs to hear. Like we can choose how we want to be, and it's with your awareness of, as you got older, and awareness of breaking down who your mom was, who your dad was, the relationship, how they formed you, what you liked, what not so much. All of that information allowed you to purposefully and intentionally choose what you want to cultivate with your daughter.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting because I think we get so encumbered by notions of gender and notions of fatherhood and motherhood. And my marriage and my relationship with my daughter is in some ways kind of the flip in terms of gender of my own family, and that's totally fine. I'm the one who's my husband was actually a lot better with my daughter when she was a small infant, and I started stepping in and becoming a bigger part of her relationship when, it came time to do things like, sort of teaching her values and having deeper conversations with her. And that's the exact opposite of what was true in my childhood. And that's so liberating. Now that I know that I can choose, we can have any family that we want. It could be any version of either one of our families of origin.
Awesome. Liz, tell everyone where they can find your book as well as all of your other writings.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. So my book, The Rocket Years, How Your 20s Launched the Rest of Your Life, you can find it anywhere books are sold, including Amazon, which is an easy place to buy it, or your local independent bookstore. And you can find my writing for Fast Company on the Fast Company website. And you can find me through my handle, Liz Segran, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of the sites.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Liz. There is so much more to talk about, and I'm sorry our time has come to an end. I think you have written a guidebook that is going to help so many in this ever-changing, wondrous time of the 20s in modern life. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
That's our show for today, everyone. Thanks for listening as always and joining us in our mission to make the world a more loving and compassionate place, one parent and one child at a time. Be the person you want your child to become. Check us out at our website, www.parentfootprint.com. Subscribe to the show and tell others about it. And finally, ask yourself the guiding question: what footprint do you want to leave?